Top down. It must have been a monstrous and intoxicating summer in 1934 where we began the talk. It opened with the Night of the Long Knives in Germany in late June. No one who had crossed Hitler politically was safe. American Ambassador William Dodd recalls in his diary the fear around the household of Hitler's Vice Chancellor Franz von Papen as he passed by in the car, wanting to signal that he wanted to help. But Papen's house being ringed with SS, turned out that only Hindenburg apparently had protected Papen, and his staff, of course, was whacked. The head of the SA and personal associate of Hitler, Ernst Röhm, was also murdered, along with scores of others that weekend. Many Germans must have been overwhelmed with horror, still more thanked Hitler. Hans Meiser, the new bishop of the Protestant church in Bavaria, almost certainly welcomed this Night of the Long Knives. Hitler's call was for Germans to imbibe a new spirit. That was his enduring call to wake up and get a new spirit. Across the Reich, church leaders, including Meiser, warmly welcomed his revival. But Hitler was about to show that he could not reach all his goals with brute force, not in his calculations at least. Rather, it would have to be compromise in some cases to reach for his real authority that he was after. I'm talking about the quasi-rational characteristic of Hitler and his circle here. As David said, this is not about Hitler as a nice guy. It's about Hitler doing more damage and destruction through having a range of tactics in his quiver. They used plausible tactics, Hitler and his circle, rationally enough. However, here's the catch: these tactics were in search of wildly unrealistic goals. That's a key point. It helps to explain both why the Germans followed Hitler and also why he was able to do so much destruction. Compromise encouraged the Germans to believe in their leader, and as he took reckless risks in search of otherworldly goals, they followed. Now, this is illustrated that same summer of 1934 in the Night of the Long Knives. The SA and German Christians led a series of large demonstrations in Bavaria and the neighboring province of Württemberg. These were aimed at convincing the people to join the Reich Church. Bavaria and Württemberg's bishops, however, were refusing to join. Well before he came to power, Hitler told Albert Speer that he dreamed of establishing a national church. It wasn't just a dream. He, of course, wanted to put that into practice. He mentioned England's Henry VIII as his model. In Germany, this would help him centralize power. There were 28 Protestant churches, each under its own bishop. Each bishop had considerable independence in his province. Each bishop also had deep allegiance from the faithful churchgoers. This allegiance to the churches and their bishops was critical. Hitler, of course, wanted to transfer it to himself, but he didn't want to act like Stalin in doing it. He didn't think he could just simply close the churches and make them archives. To centralize his power, Hitler wished to bring all 28 bishops under this Reich bishop, who in turn would answer directly to him. If he got the bishops to think like he did, Hitler reasoned, they in turn would influence their flocks, working toward social Gleichschaltung, or alignment. In fact, the way the bishops exercised personal leadership over distinct cultural pockets of the folk was similar to the way that Hitler wanted his regional leaders to exercise allegiance and to direct popular opinion. It was called Menschenführung, the ability to stand up, galvanize attention, and influence people to do as you say. Hitler soon succeeded in getting 26 of Germany's 28 Protestant bishops to submit to the authority of his Reich bishop, Ludwig Müller. But Bishop Meiser and his neighbor, Bishop Theophil Worm, were having none of it. They voiced fear that the Reich Church would not be Protestant enough, and they did not want to give up their southern independence to Prussian Berlin. critically, they got their many churches across southern Germany to go along with them, the people. They brought the discussion about a Reich church from the upper echelons to the people themselves. I don't think the other bishops did that. What's more, these two bishops proved that despite all their promises, parades, and bullying, regional Nazi leaders could make no inroads against them. The struggle and the results were on display one day in mid-August 1934. This pitted a young, ambitious Nazi, Karl Holz, against Miser and Worm, the bishop. Holz was the deputy of Julius Streicher, Gauleiter of Franconia, and the former editor of Der Stürmer. Holz called a big rally on Adolf Hitler Square in Nuremberg to denounce Miser and to win popular opinion for the Reich Church. Hearing of Holz's rally, Protestants sent news through informal channels that Miser would be speaking at the nearby St. Sebaldus Church that same evening. So they had informal channels of communication that were still operative. Of course, this is 1934. This is early on before Hitler consolidates power firmly, as he would in 4 years and more. Hearing of Holzer's rally, the Protestants sent this news. Miser arrived on the square, the bishop, that evening and headed to his church. And at that moment, much of the crowd that were there at Holz's rally turned to follow Miser into his church. The rally Holz was having petered out. It was a dramatic turning point. On September the 15th, the following month, that was just a few days after the famous Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg. That's Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will Party Congress. The Frankische Zeitung, the daily newspaper of the Nazi Party in Streicher's Franconia, published an article declaring with headlines, "Miser commits treason, Miser establishes a confessional front." This was the language repeated by these regional authorities who were getting very concerned about this, the confessional front. They saw it as a separate movement, one that was detracting from Hitler's movement. This, fed up with trying to change opinion and not winning, Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller simply declared that Miser and Worm were no longer bishops, put them under arrest, and named a few other people to take their place. This did not work. Swarms of Protestants had already been protesting on behalf of church independence. Now these gatherings multiplied. Now they held church services around the house of Bishop Miser himself. Now their hero was becoming a kind of martyr. In consternation, Bavarian Governor Franz Epp and Minister President Ludwig Siebert sent urgent appeals to Hitler. Only Hitler could intervene effectively at this point, given the disagreement between these officials and the Reich bishop, who had Hitler's authority. Only Hitler had authority. Only he could make the delicately balanced judgment about whether to go forward with brute force, taking Bishop Müller's tactics forward, or back away for the moment. Hitler tried strenuously to remain above such controversies, of course, leaving his underlings to take the blame for anything unpopular. That was a key aspect, I think, of his power. But he had to intervene at this point, he could see that. And he reversed the course of brute force, conceding to the bishops, restoring them to their positions.
All of the bishops?
Two of them who were, yes, that's right. He fired Müller and never trusted him again with a position of real authority. He had just been too ham-fisted to actually persuade people in the way that Hitler wanted to. Hitler probably did not consider this a defeat so much as a necessary step in order to move forward at the fastest pace possible while consolidating support. During the Night of the Long Knives, several months earlier, Hitler had consolidated his support with stark brutality, and everybody was on notice that this could happen. Now he used compromise for the same reason, and he got a pretty good deal. Bishop Miser, the gifted mobilizer of opinion, never again mobilized his churchgoers against the Nazi goal. In fact, he really lined up support from then on, and most was silent. So Hitler compromised in this case because he was dealing with popular traditions, and he was looking at the long run, which he hoped to compress into the short run. Of course, he could have easily forced these two bishops to comply, but he wanted to move forward only as long as he could bring the people with him. This is a key point. I like to use the metaphor, it's a bit clumsy, but of a dance, with, if you can imagine that, Hitler leading a dance across the floor toward National Socialism. Try to keep the people with you. If they stumble, you slow up and maybe do something else to bring them along. He wanted real authority that the people chose. Here, one of Hitler's basic principles of domestic leadership is relevant in his thinking. Policies and programs must not interrupt an ever-growing popular faith in his leadership, the momentum. He wanted to keep it moving. The evolution of Germans into Nazis must never slow to a halt. Open, direct opposition to the dictatorship was cut off by brute terror, of course, but this suppression was only a beginning step in Hitler's imagined program. That's the point. The enormous task of transforming the people into Nazis still remained. And this had to be done primarily with persuasion. Hitler thought he certainly did intend to establish a totalitarian state. That was Hitler's aim, obviously, but he wished to base it on a totalitarian society. He wanted the state to be based on society so that Nazism would endure 1,000 years. That was his plan. He was not planning merely on a succession of leaders who would wield military force on behalf of his ideas. Rather, he aimed at aligning German customs with National Socialism so that the people would pass down their norms, their practices, their attitudes from one generation to another. He theorized in Mein Kampf that if social norms matched government policy, the government would be unshakable. Had several pillars. The first pillar in his theory of power is popular support. Once you have a majority, or at least the appearance of majority, then you can begin to use police force, as Hitler said, to stabilize your first pillar of popular support. You can't just pull the Constitution out of your briefcase and say, hey folks, here's our new plan. You have to have people looking at you first and willing to agree, he writes in Mein Kampf. So he wanted to establish this totalitarian society. He started already in, of course, 1920 with this mass movement in the 1920s. And it's, of course, true in theory that if social norms match government policy, it's unshakable. You don't have a top and a bottom anymore. But it's a piece of Hitlerian insanity. In theory, it's true, but Hitler believed that he could actually align these attitudes and behavior in his own lifetime. At least that's what he set out to do. In Nazi theory, and Hitler really stressed this, law in the new state would be expressed by the healthy sentiment of the folk. Hitler called this a primitive human instinct, the healthy sentiment, that drove degenerates away. One might think that Hitler would be the first to go. But degenerates would be shamed and crushed without a judicial system. Again, in theory, it may work. But first, the folk had to fully be aligned. Hitler did not reach power only to forget about the movement he began in the 20s. Rather, he continued to build it as his foundation. So this was the job of Nazism that made Hitler willing to compromise. National Socialism, Hitler said, was the agent of a transition of our folk so that it would become this total society of Nazi sentiment. Propaganda Joseph Goebbels put it this way in June of 1935. We hope the day will come when nobody needs to talk about National Socialism anymore, since it has become the air that we breathe. People must get used to behaving this way inwardly. They must make it into their own set of attitudes. People would behave like Nazis even when nobody was looking. But How could Hitler make Nazism an agent of transition? One important mechanism was the belief in Hitler, not just in what he had already done, but that if Hitler knew there was injustice, he always made things right. Compromise helped to sustain this popular belief that if he knew, things would be aligned the way they thought it should be. Here's one example. In December 1940, the chief of Nazi terror, Heinrich Himmler, closed the Euthanasia killing center at Grafenik. This had to be done because the killings at Grafenik, Himmler wrote, were upsetting so many people. The methods for killing would have to be changed so that they were not so offensive. Meanwhile, propaganda would work to intensely change opinion to match this policy. Thus, opinion would come to coincide with euthanasia. Eventually, the folk would accept the reality that people went to the hospital not just to be healed, but to be killed. How soon could this happen? In 1940, it was still premature. Many reports showed that large segments of the folk did not believe the official story that there were no murders. The secrecy was not tight enough. People were starting to question Nazi leadership. Strikingly, however, and I think this is the key point here, they continued to maintain faith in Hitler by believing that he only knew the official story. He knew the story that people were not being killed. He did not know the real story, or at least not enough of it. This faith in the Fuhrer is documented in a letter in late November 1940 from a trusted longtime Nazi Party member. Her name was Elsa von Löwis. In a matter of days, her letter made its way to Himmler, and he acted at once. Löwis was the head of a local Nazi women's organization, and she wrote this: "Now the people are still clinging to the hope that the Fuhrer does not know about these things, cannot know, otherwise he would intervene. But I have the feeling that this cannot go on much longer before this trust will also be shaken. It is always so moving to meet this trust. The Fuhrer knows nothing of it. We must preserve this weapon untarnished like no other." An insightful witness, and Himmler took note, the popular will to believe that Hitler only did everything right was a weapon like no other, a basic structure of social control within the Reich. 2 days after receiving the letter, Himmler wrote this: "The worst feeling has arisen in the region around Grafenik, and in my opinion there remains only one thing, to discontinue the use of the institution in this place." Hitler and his circle compromised in order to maintain the movement and to keep it advancing forward. This was at a cost to the dictatorship in time. It considered these compromises temporary, of course. Later, it always planned on aligning everything. While its calculations about timing did become increasingly skewed, calculating from prison, Hitler wrote that the process of transformation for uniting the people in a Nazi national community could take many generations. Maybe he was thinking of Christianity and how long that had taken. He did seem to want to replace Christianity with his own worldview. In August of 1932, however, he was more wishful, saying that to an American journalist, "Only after a movement has been underway 70 or 80 years will it have developed the historic background and traditions that would enable it to carry on without a strong leader." He's planning on having this carry on without a strong leader. His job was to get society there, as he said in 1934, even more unrealistically. By the time his successor had taken over, the German folk must be so committed to National Socialism that anyone considering resistance would see that this was impossible. They'd have to resist society itself. Throughout his dictatorship, Hitler stuck to his breathtakingly unrealistic goal, using whatever goal lay at hand to try to maximize the speed of the popular transformation. One tactic was to assail church customs region by region, rather than attacking them across the Reich all at once with directives from Berlin at the top. A benefit of this was that the folk did not have cause for rising up in protest at the same time around the Reich. Another asset, of course, was that it isolated Hitler from controversy. Orders like those abridging religious instruction in schools were local, originating at the Gauleiter level. Thus, these lower-level officials bore the brunt of protest, not Hitler. A paradox the dictatorship worked with was that the people's faith in Hitler could be sustained as long as the lies about him could be sustained. Hitler ordered his Gauleiter to make progress, but without causing scenes of unrest. They tried to slip the rug out from under the folk so slyly that the people had hardly noticed before they found themselves resting very comfortably on the new Nazi carpet. In the mid and later 1930s, the dictatorship used Hitler's portrait as a proxy for him and his presence. Crucifixes from Catholic public schools were removed, but in their place was hung a portrait of Hitler. When Catholics did not seem to accept this as a substitute, portraits of Hitler with children were introduced. Maybe that would work. Remember Hitler's principal tactic of offering substitute for something taken. I think it is a principal tactic. He, of course, talks about this. He noted in Mein Kampf that, quote, "Nobody has the right to deprive simple people of their childish certainties until they have acquired others that are more reasonable." Is that a benevolent dictator or just a condescending one? To fight an ideology, he said, one needed to introduce a substitute ideology. Only in the struggle of two views of life can brute force work in favor of the side it supports. It's not as if you compromise only either. You use them in tandem, brute force and compromise. Bismarck, Hitler thought, had lost the battle against Marxism because he had relied too directly on rote force. Replacing crucifixes with Hitler's portrait evoked Hitler's authority, yet the Fuhrer was held above the fray. He was not present and not subject to criticism. Indeed, some people, that's interesting, some groups of people protesting the removal of crucifixes in Kloppenburg in 1936 took confidence in their protest from their belief that Hitler would certainly back them if he knew. Many of them, or at least some of them, were writing to party officials saying, "You don't know how important the crucifix is for us. There's got to be a mistake here. Let's just let you know the crucifix is key to Catholic faith." So they wrote to party officials instructing them. In Kloppenburg, the protesters won for the moment as Gauleiter Rover retracted the removal of crucifixes. He had a meeting at a large hall, and he began trying to talk about the importance of racial purity and his time in Africa, but people kept saying, as is illustrated here, "Zur Sache, get to the point." And so finally, quickly, he rescinded the decree. And Bormann in 1939 illustrates why Hitler didn't think he could just give decrees from the top and go home. In 1939, Hitler's private aide Martin Bormann issued a decree ordering that all schools were now German community schools. They were secular. There were no more Catholic schools, no more Protestant schools, and thus there would be no more signs of religion. But history did not follow Hitler's order. Despite this decree, crucifixes could still be found, at least in some schools years later, with populations rising up to defend them. Hitler believed that simple decrees from the top ordering church practices to discontinue could not achieve exactly what he wanted. Stalin had other ideas about control and ruling. Hitler charged his Gauleiters, the regional Nazi leaders, to lead everyone into becoming Nazis, but without stirring public scenes of dissent. Goebbels assailed Rover, the Gauleiter here, who caused this uproar in Kloppenburg. He called him a clumsy little oaf. That's quite something from Goebbels, given his stature. Now, Hitler was less harsh and said that Rover had committed tactical error. The churches were a major obstacle to consensus Hitler saw, but not the only one. Take, for example, Brandenburg State Judge Lothar Kreisig, an outspoken critic of the regime at some points. Already in 1935, the judiciary wrote up charges against this judge for a list of offenses. Already in 1935, he had refused to join the party. in mid-1940, having refused to join the party again. And at the peak of Hitler's acclaim, following Germany's defeat of France, Kreisig began criticizing Nazi euthanasia. It was a tough time to speak out, but he wasn't looking at that apparently. Kreisig also refused to send any incurables, those who were being euthanized, from his jurisdiction in Brandenburg to hospitals where they were being killed. Then he went another step and formally filed murder charges against Philip Bohler, who developed Nazi euthanasia, when Justice Minister showed him Hitler's note, trying to convince him that this was legal and lawful. Kreisig responded that it didn't convince him. Hitler didn't necessarily make the laws. Well, this was, of course, grist for the Gestapo, along with party officials, to begin planning to send Kreisig to a concentration camp. And it's interesting that Hitler intervened, granting Kreisig a mercy edict. The case against Kreisig was closed. He retired as he requested and with a pension. Punishing Kreisig could lead to popular unrest in Saxony, the judge's province, as Roland Freiser had warned, of all people. Exempting him, on the other hand, could pay dividends, as Hitler hoped. It kept the possibility open, at least, that Kreisig could come to use his ability to mobilize opinion on behalf of Hitler. In a similar act, Hitler exempted Bishop Galen from execution that Martin Bormann and other high party officials demanded when he spoke out against euthanasia from the pulpit. Hitler put off Galen's punishment until after the war, and this gave the bishop a chance to prove himself in the meantime. Perhaps Galen and Kreisig felt some gratitude toward Hitler for his mercy. There is a good essay on how the gallows in early modern England kept people feeling grateful if they weren't hanging from them. They always had a gallows visible on the horizon. In any case, Hitler soon reaped the benefit of his mercy compromise. Bishops had authority to shape the opinion of millions of Germans, and as conservative nationalists, some gave Hitler a big assist. For example, they supported the war. The war served the holy will of God, the Catholic episcopacy told their faithful. And in September 1941, 1 month after his famous protests against euthanasia, Galen himself proclaimed that God would treat Germans slain in this new crusade against Bolshevism quite similar to holy martyrs. They claim. This ringing endorsement of the war on its own was a good deal in exchange for Hitler's compromise in not executing the bishop, right? Compromises had benefits, but beyond that, they were also signals for Hitler. And I think this is a point worth considering. For a regime seeking some fundamental changes in German attitudes, the German folk acted like an internal clock for Hitler, directing his sense of timing. Of course, Hitler knew what to do. Mass popular unrest helped him to know when, how quickly he could do it. He tried to avoid very strenuously any kind of unrest, but when it did happen, it was a signal strategically to protect his image. It made sense for Hitler to use dissent as a message from the masses about how fast he could move forward, transforming ideology into policy. To maintain his prestige, the leader was willing to step back for the moment and then continue toward his goal in a different, less direct course, laterally, if the people could follow, to keep the people along. Note that Hitler's compromises are only on behalf of masses of folk, made toward dissent with very substantial backing in popular attitudes, really in popular traditions, certainly not small groups, but masses whose traditions pushed back against Hitler's trajectory. Of course, there were many ways in which Hitler's course overlapped with German traditions. That's how he got started. Nationalism was a huge, powerful current they both shared. And if Germany had conquered the continent, it's hard not to think that resistance would have withered almost entirely away. To understand why Hitler compromised, look at his special position with the folk and compare it with that of Himmler, the chief of police. German women were a key part of his constituency, and Hitler did not think he could push them around. The frailest women, he said, will become a hero when the life of her own child is at stake. Heinrich Himmler, head of SS and police, had a different take on how to respond to this mother-child relationship. To suppress insubordination, Himmler recommended decapitating a man, putting his head at the feet in the casket, and then at this point the mother would become the regime's most convincing voice of propaganda, urging other mothers to keep their sons from charting a similar fate. Himmler was talking about how to keep persons in his organization in line. Hitler was a Führer with a direct relationship to the folk itself. His image was the focal point of German consensus. He had to unveil his plans slowly to the extent that they were not accepted immediately. And he said that if his mother was still living, she would certainly be going to church, and he could not stop her. He had to sort of wait for that generation to fade away while bringing up the new one quickly in the sense of National Socialism. I believe that was the plan. So the story of compromise is about Hitler to an unusual extent. That's another point of this, since it's about the direct relationship of Hitler to the German folk itself. Relative to other aspects of Nazi history, it is Hitler-centric. Hitler was the chief arbiter of particularly delicate issues related to popular sentiment. Because he was a leader of the entire enterprise, this fundamentally entailed moving people toward thinking like he did. This is actually illustrated in efforts in 1938 to drive Bishop Sproul away from his diocese in Rothenburg. The judiciary had filed charges long enough to make Bishop Sproul a head shorter, but they chose in Berlin to try to have an uprising of people to see whether the people were embodying Nazism, to act as a law, to drive him out. They had nightly demonstrations, but this went awry when the crowd started breaking in and harassing and even harming the bishop, and that led to counter-protests on behalf of the bishop. And that's why the authorities had kept instructing the people to be disciplined, not to start attacking the bishop and wreaking havoc on property. The interesting part there is that when the regional officials decided this had gone too far and had to stop, the Reich's chancellery said only Hitler has the authority to stop this, and Heydrich, who had been keeping an eye on it, apparently did get the authority of Hitler to stop this, because this whole thing stopped. And of course they just had to wheel in the Gestapo and they carted the bishop. Could have done that at any time. I guess certainly must have been upset about the whole miser event, where people had come out on behalf of the bishop, and they wanted to show that perhaps that they could get the people against the bishop to the same extent. It didn't quite work. The Gestapo was there, and off Sproul went for the rest of the Third Reich. However, he, I think, lived in relative comfort relative to some other Germans. Hitler, of course, then as the author of National Socialism, was really in charge of this delicate mechanism and his own image. He was very lazy in a lot of ways, waking up at the crack of dawn and watching movies a lot, but he was extremely disciplined about how his image came across. And he didn't seem to go wrong there. Of course, he started losing the war. It's possible to question whether Hitler wasn't bending over too far backwards to solicit the folk, and whether he could have done more by force, but it's certain that he did make these compromises. Now, this was shown in September of 1938 during the Sudeten crisis. Fear of war caused hundreds of thousands of Germans to flee the French border. Masses flooded the roads, hampering the Wehrmacht's ability to plan. Further, the regime had no idea where most of these refugees were headed. Doesn't sound like National Socialism. The propaganda was that this is the way French acted. The Germans were all disciplined and following orders. Not surprisingly, top army leaders Jodl urgently asked Hitler to issue orders regulating this mass turbulence. It made military sense, but Hitler did not do it. Probably he did not want to test his real authority in such a blatant way. What if his orders did not quell the uproar? What if they had to use police force and it was traced to him? The turbulence threatened Nazi images of Germans as orderly. If hundreds of thousands of Germans were starting to move, Hitler should be leading them. This would also bring attention to the fact that he wasn't. When similar scenes of mass chaos recurred a year later, when war did actually start on the French border again, didn't happen on the Polish border, the Germans on the French border, once again, hundreds of thousands, started moving inland, and Hitler again, under request, refused to put his authority to a test by issuing orders. Later, after the defeat of France, he issued some triumphant notice saying that everybody had behaved very well and that everything had gone as planned. Masses hindered military maneuvers, yet Hitler weighed the needs of the people as if they comprised a power center against the demands of the army's top brass. He came down on the side of the people. I think it is probably also arguable that sustaining the popularity among the people was also critical for sustaining his support in the military. Hitler could have unleashed force to keep the Germans out of the army's way. He could have had his way with force, but that is not the kind of authority he wanted. In conclusion, Hitler understood that real authority had limits. He was cautious about the demands he made on his constituents. With occasional compromises, the folk was calmed. Their faith that if only the Führer knew was restored. This applies, of course, only to the so-called German-blooded people, the Gentiles. Of course, not all those either. Certainly the social outsiders would not be of any use protesting or speaking up. And it's not as if the people could get together and decide, hey, let's go out and protest, we want Hitler to do this. It had to derive from all these people acting together at once, unorganized, based on their traditions and what they believed in, and the sense often that they thought Hitler would agree with them and what Germany was. Toward this constituency, Hitler did not suppose that he could prevent the feared stab in the back by force, I submit, without injuring popular will to fight war. It didn't change during the war. As other official agencies stepped up their use of force to control specific groups of the people, the Wehrmacht executing some 20,000 for not being with the program, Hitler's deep anxiety about another stab in the back on the home front bolstered his reasons for compromising. Already in September of 1941, as he was forced to rethink his scorn for the Red Army, Hitler, through Heydrich, issued an order prohibiting any attacks on institutions from which the German folk drew strength. So we see that up until the end of 1944 at least, as far as the record extends, Hitler refused to use even soft methods of coercion to force compliance with the regime's will on civilian evacuations. This happened in October of 1943. A Gauleiter from Hamburg tried to manipulate the distribution of food rations in order to keep women in their sites of evacuation. They kept returning to the Ruhrgebiet, which was, of course, being bombed into the pavement. And this was, of course, taking up trains. It wasn't. There were various problems with the fact that women kept coming and going, and so a Gauleiter steps up, and the women get their way when they protest in Witten in 1943. They get food stamps in Witten, in nearby cities, and this continues with the division among the Gauleiters. Some Gauleiters want to use this tactic to keep their people where they should be out of harm's way, and others are saying, no, that's not the way of National Socialism. Hitler himself is still encouraging education. And Goebbels, who wrote in November of 1943 something very interesting. He says the people are starting to discover the soft spot of the regime. They're starting to understand. He talks about people going on the street to get their own way, to force the regime to follow their will. And he said the problem with this is that you start to lose authority, you lose bit by bit, and soon you don't have any authority. And so he took this problem to Hitler in January of 1944, saying half the Gauleiters want to use this method of withholding food stamps, the other half are against it. This was in January of 1944, and Hitler came down against even that soft method of coercion. He said, no, that's not the geeignet, it's not the appropriate means. You have to educate them. So again, you have this impossible Hitler telling the Gauleiters to change the people, but just do it through persuasion so that they like it. And we see that Hitler, through Bormann and also Himmler, are on some of these memos that go out through at least October of 1944, reiterating Hitler's decision that even the soft method of coercion, that is of manipulating food stamps, rations, is not to be used, let alone police terror. They had also tried to, at some point, get the Reichsbahn not to issue train tickets to these people, but the Reichsbahn wasn't having anything of it, so that they weren't going to exercise force over that aspect either. So you might say, weren't they bending over too far backward? Wasn't Hitler, obviously he wasn't meeting his timeline, that's for sure. So we see that, in the end, we should ask, what is the significance of compromise in conclusion for understanding Hitler's rule? What's at stake? First, I think Hitler was a strategist, not by choice, but because he did not always think he could resort to brute force to achieve all his goals. Of course, compromise could be used together with force in tandem. And rather, he used a range of tactics, even beyond propaganda and charisma as well, to maintain his unique position as a symbol leading folk unity. Second, in his choice of tactics, Hitler was opportunistic, choosing whatever tactic he thought could help at the moment. This opportunism is highlighted particularly by the dictatorship's propensity to improvise within circumstances. That is, timing was opportunistic, moving at the moment when something was possible. And this supports more recent research that not all destruction and cruelty originated at the top, but was supposed to be carried out by subordinates who could also think for themselves, not only those who followed orders so carefully that you can read orders as an account of what actually happened. Perpetration was decentralized, orders were sometimes part of camouflage. Nationalist socialism, in conclusion, wrote a harrowing story, yet I think we're fascinated because it's somewhat familiar. It's the story of coherence, collectivity, chasing catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you.